I'd like to say hi to everybody. Greetings to all the folks in Australia from Knoxville, Tennessee. Since the automobile was first produced, various types of reliability and endurance runs were staged in an effort to publicize one manufacturer's success over the other. Back as far as 1917, here in California, there was a renewed interest in fuel economy, and the Los Angeles motor car dealers started to publicize the mileage potential of their cars with what was called then the Camp Curry Yosemite economy runs. These went through the 20s and eventually were supervised and sanctioned by the contest board of the American Automobile Association, which of course we know as AAA, with safeguards to minimize cheating. And the rules were tightened, and then probably in the late 20s, these faded into history. Well, back in late 1935, Gilmore Oil Company decided it was time to revise the economy runs with a one-day trip from Los Angeles to Yosemite National Park. And they put out a set of rules on how the run was conducted. And this is actually from 1936. This was their first set of rules about the equipment on the cars, how the cars were to be treated, and with how much stock status. Everything had to be totally stock. And these runs continued through 1941 and then were revived in 1950 as the MOBILGAS Grand Canyon Economy Run. Rules and procedures were carried out from the days of the 30s, but were refined to meet the current environment. On your screen, you will notice an ad in the Age from Melbourne announced that the MOBILGAS Economy Run was coming to Australia, celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Vacuum Oil Proprietary Limited. Now, the MOBILGAS name was well known as one of the rotating sponsors of the Round Australia trials, along with AMPO and REDX. Now, like the AAA in the States, the Royal Auto Club of Victoria and the National Road Motorists Association of New South Wales were conducted to jointly conduct and supervise the event to show the car owners the potential fuel consumption of their cars when properly driven and maintained. Now, the rules basically followed those from the 1950 event, pretty much word for word, as far as entries about the cars being delivered for inspection, stock status, and various areas were sealed, including the carburetor, distributor, gas tanks, and all of that. Now, the first event in Australia was open to all makes and models that were sold in Australia, regardless of where they were manufactured. So you had entries from England, Europe, Canada, and the United States. And there were 4 classes in Australia. The entire time of the economy runs, they were all based on engine size, while in the United States, only makes and models manufactured and produced were allowed to compete, and the classes were based on price. Low, medium, high, upper, medium, and high. Beginning in 1958, the imports would have their own run, but it was very short-lived. Now, the entries were provided by the entrants. They were actually invited to enter the run, and they were delivered to the officials prior, where certain parts were sealed and tampering. And the entries were painted and lettered. So we can go to the next slide, Simon, to show the dealer's name, that was the economy run, where they were going, and the make of car. And if you'll see here, it pretty much followed the same format as the United States. The top shot is the Chevrolet Bel Air 8 entry from 1955, and the bottom one is from 1958. That was the outright winner. Now, to determine the winners and the outright winners, here it was called the Sweepstakes Award. In Australia, it was the outright winner. Was done by what was called a ton-mile formula. And this goes back to the early days, where the formula was used to compensate for weights of cars. Basically, what the ton-mile formula did was the weight of the car and passengers in tons was multiplied by the distance traveled and then divided by the amount of gasoline used. Now, this formula was never completely understood, was always open to questions. And in advertising, usually you would find the actual miles per gallon figures were used. The weight of the car was calculated with a full tank of gas plus 650 pounds, comprising the weight of 4 passengers. Now, if the weight was less than that, lead ballast was used to bring that up. Observers, to make sure that all of the rules and regulations were observed, were members from the Mobile Traffic Branch from Victoria Police Force and also members of the RAC. You can show the next slide, Simon. You can see this is from 1957. So you can see that all of the entries, both here in Australia, were pretty brightly painted. And in addition to the mileage, it was a fairly colorful event in my personal opinion. Now, in Australia, trophies, winter sashes, and even cash prizes were awarded to the winners. In the United States here, it was only trophies were awarded, although some manufacturers were known to have compensated the drivers. What I found out was very interesting in Australia is that for the 11 years that the run was conducted, there were different starting and finishing locations were selected where every state except the Northern Territory was represented. The state RACs and NRMAs were used as needed, and the total miles remained constant, usually about 1,000 to 1,500. And the longest was 1,569 miles back in '66. Where here in the States, they all started in Los Angeles. That was the impound area, and eventually increased year to year going cross country. Now, the outright winners received 850 pounds prize with the trophy. Each class winner was awarded 250 pounds, and the second place received 1,200 pounds. There was always problems with damage to vehicles in these runs. The winners had to have the winner, which that year was a Goliath, German Goliath, and having to have its windscreen replaced after the stone shattered due to road conditions. And I'd like to also direct you to, there's a 45-minute movie on YouTube. It's titled Mobil Oil Company, the MOBILGAS 1950 Grand Canyon Run. This was produced by Mobil, and it's also rare. It's in color. It shows how the cars were inspected. It shows the unique refueling operations at the time, and gives you, both here in the United States and in Australia, kind of a guide to see how the run was conducted that first year. And it continued each year, going for a longer distance, and rules were refined as necessary. In Australia, the dates were changed quite often depending on when the run could be set up. And they were not referred to usually by year, but by number. So the second economy run went from Sydney to Southport in October of '56. And the rules were really tightened. They wanted to make sure the cars were strictly stock and they were impounded prior to the run and inspected more thoroughly. And they also had a more precise refueling process, which you'll see in the movie I mentioned earlier. Now, by this time, overdrive was starting, or freewheeling it was called, was starting to become a little more available. And so a special class was added for those vehicles, but pretty much all the cars had pretty much standard transmission. Things stayed pretty calm in the States. The classes remained the same, although they had a special class only in 1956 for the small limited displacement, like the Rambler and the Studebaker. Again, we got a lot of various issues with even a broken petrol tank, but they were able to repair it, were able to continue, where pretty much in the States, if you had a major problem, you were forced to withdraw. Now, I found it interesting in doing some research that in 1956, a prankster removed some of the guide signs and reposted them in an effort to lead the cars astray and actually pointing them to the local town dump. Now, officials doing a preliminary run discovered this and corrected this before any competitors arrived. So they all stayed on the same course. Um, Here in the States, in 1963, a flagman redirected a group of cars coming into Lincoln because he thought they'd do better on a brand new freeway and repassing the route. So that year, the United States Auto Club, which replaced AAA, decided that there's about 281 miles needed to be eliminated to keep it fair for everyone. There were timing requirements, and if you got caught in traffic or arrived late, you up through 1956, you were disqualified. There were no runs in Australia in 1957, but here in the United States, they started with having women allowed to compete for the first time with a complicated set of rules. And in 1958, the third economy run that went from Melbourne to Adelaide also had a special class for women drivers, and 2 classes were added in addition to the standard transmission. But we had cars with automatic transmissions replacing the overdrive models. It was quite a complicated rule for the women in 57, which caused a little bit of controversy here, which was changed the following year. Also, by this time, they were limiting the field to about 35 to 40 models. And so only one car of each make could be entered, and it was limited to the 37 top selling models in Australia. The sportsmanship was always key in both economy runs. In 1958, the prizes were awarded based on what they called the provisional results. And after the prizes had been awarded, the organizing group discovered there was an error in calculation that involved one of the changes, which where a Jaguar edged out the presumed winner, Austin A105. It caused a little bit of controversy, but sportsmanship and understanding of the rules always prevailed, even when a snafu like this occurred. And this sportsmanship was noted as far back as 1939 here in the States. Half the field got caught in an unexpected snowstorm coming into Yosemite, and half the field was disqualified for late arrivals. In 1959, it was the only time that the Australian run was held in Western Australia, and it was the first time exclusively staged in one state. But here in the States, major changes. Now, in Australia, you still had the 10 mile per gallon formula because they wanted to continue to have an outright winner. But by end of 1958, USAC said, we need to change the rules. Only the heavier weighted cars were the top winners, sweepstakes, with an Imperial Crown capturing the sweepstakes for the 3rd year in a row. So they went to not having an overall winner and put in special gas tanks to ensure precise measurements. Simon, if you can show the next slide. This is from 1967. This is where they are, quote unquote, topping off the tank. You'll notice in that bright red gas tank that's installed in the trunk, this is the 67 Chrysler 300. It had temperature monitoring devices, so they had precise measurements. These tanks were used exclusively here from 1959 through 1968. They were never used in Australia, and they continued using the old formula of just pre-measuring the capacity of the gas tanks. Now, in 1960, they did do in Australia a straight change to regular miles per gallon for the class winners, but they wanted to keep having an outright winner. And so they kept that for the automatic transmission and the women's classes. And what's unique about 1960 is their visit to Tasmania, where they actually took the ferry across the Bass Strait to Tasmania. Before I run out of time, I just want to cover a couple little bits of information. Starting in 1962, the need in Australia for an outright winner continued. Here in the States, the car that got the actual highest mileage actually kept that you see American as having the winning the economy run, because except for 2 years, they scored the best mileage. A special award started in 1962 for an entry that had the greatest percentage increase in miles per gallon over the average in its class. And nobody could understand the rationale runs that would try and smooth things out. Now, something else happened. You can do the next slide, Simon.
Yep. We've just got 5 minutes left, Dave. Just so.
Got a clock here too. Yeah. The term slipstreaming came into effect in 1962, as you'll see from this photo, where in order to aid aerodynamics, the cars would run bumper to bumper to kind of increase their mileage. It's kind of like pack racing at Daytona and Talladega here in the States. This tactic was addressed for 1963, tightening the rules, and penalties were made if entries traveled consistently less than 3 lengths behind another vehicle. The runs continued off and on through 1964. Pretty much everything stayed the same. The added a class for teenagers. The Warwick Cup, which is now called the Perpetual Trophy, or the class winner, was now for the class winner that covered the total distance in the shortest amount of time, kind of making it a miles per gallon, miles per hour contest. There were no runs in 65 due to transfer dates from CAMS. And in 1966, it turned out to be pretty much the last run. And Simon, I just lost you.
Yeah, you did?
Yeah, I don't have the screen. I'm back to my home screen.
Oh, right. Okay.
So let me just quickly wrap up. I talked about cars that were damaged in that. If you could show that last slide, Simon.
Yep. Yeah, that's on now.
Okay, this is from 1966, one of the few accidents that occurred. A Ford Fairlane rear-ended this Dodge Dart. Fairlane was eliminated, and but the Dart went on to win his class. Now, after 66, Mobil's publicity department started to back away here in the United States from competition support. And in 1968, we saw the final economy run here. It ended in a whimper rather than a big celebration as planned. It was terminated 2 days before the finish due to the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, in Australia, Mobil was also changing their focal point. Beginning in 64, they teamed up with various manufacturers to conduct performance tests. And while these were advertised to be under a strict time schedule and under strict economy run conditions, they were very limited. These continued through at least 1971. And as a result, even though there was talk of a 1967 economy run in Australia, it ended too without much fanfare as they continued these performance tests, and these also faded into history. I'd like to just kind of close by saying times had changed. Performance was the name of the game in the late 60s, with gas economy not as important to most motoring public, again, until the first oil shock in 1973. These economy runs, both in the United States and Australia, became important parts of motoring history. Now, not without some controversy and skepticism from the public or at times the motoring press. They did provide a yardstick to potential economy of various models, noting that they were driven for a lot of times by professional drivers with finely tuned cars. Now, even today, we hear still the same questions posed by the public that we heard back in the 60s and the 50s during the economy runs. Why can't I get the same mileage in my car as these figures show? And the only answer I can give you, and it's still true today, your mileage may vary.
Thank you, Dave.
Okay.
I will throw it open now to some questions.
And do you know how I can get my video feedback or?
Yep, I've just stopped sharing now, so it should just be. No, I'm not sure why you're not seeing the video, Dave, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, mine just totally dropped. I have my actually I've got my home screen on.
Could you give us some indication of what a typical, say, let's pick the Chrysler 300, what sort of fuel economy improvement would they make over what the average fuel economy of a 300?
Well, okay, for example, that 67 Chrysler that you saw, that was driven by I would say a non-professional driver, by a Chrysler dealer, Hart Fullerton, and he won the class. And that did, hold on a second, I got the figures right here. He won that class with 17.59 miles per gallon over a course from Los Angeles to Detroit of 2,800 miles.
And an average for a car like that probably be 12 miles a gallon or something?
Back in those days, I would say probably, without properly tuned in that, I would estimate probably 12 to 14, 15.
Cool. Okay, so some perspective there. Are there any other questions from the virtual or the physical audience at all on Dave's?
Yeah, just got one question, please.
Yep.
Dave,
Paul Behringer's asking a question. Dave?
car companies use the results of the mode tests. How do the car companies use the results of those tests in their marketing? Were they heavily promoted?
Yes, they did. Heavily promoted through probably about 1965, 66. Very heavily promoted by Studebaker through the 50s, heavily by American Motors and also by Chrysler. General Motors, not so much. They did advertise the Chevy's performance. Bulk of the advertising was newspapers.
Recall Holden mates, yes. Here in Australia.
Okay, and some other perspectives there. David, Norm was saying that he notes that there may have been some Holden promotion over here on those
Yes.
tests as well. Yeah.
Oh yes, they did it all. They did the Tirana. I've got articles and ads going back to the HR and
Yep.
also with the Tirana, and also they did the one with the HQ Moneros.
Great. Okay. Look, some good discussion there. I think we'll again move on. Thank you very much, Dave. So to finalize it, thank you.
Yeah, do you know how I can